April 29, 1945. A coal yard behind the walls of Dachau. Some 50 men stand against a low masonry wall, their hands raised above their heads. Their weapons are already on the ground. They have already surrendered. And in front of them, a single American machine gun is trained on the line. Then the gun begins to fire. The men at the base of the wall begin to fold and drop, and the sound of it rolls off the brick and out across the camp. A soldier is crouched over that gun firing, and he is barely 19 years old. Then a man comes running. He does not shout an order first. He fires his pistol into the air once, and the crack of it cuts through everything. He grabs the gunner by the collar and hauls him off the weapon and throws him to the ground. He is screaming now, close to the boy's face, demanding to know what in God's name he thinks he is doing. The boy is crying. He can barely speak. The prisoners were trying to escape, he says. That is all he can offer. That is his defense. The man with the pistol does not believe him. Remember that pistol. Before this day is over, it will be raised twice. His name is Felix Sparks. He is 27 years old, a lieutenant colonel, and he has just become one of the first American officers to walk into Dachau. And this photograph, this exact moment, the officer with the raised pistol and the dead man at the wall, will be captured by a U.S. Army photographer standing a few feet away. It will outlive every man in that yard. It will follow Sparks for the rest of his life. Because within hours the American who stopped the killing will be accused of the killing. And the case will climb all the way up the chain of command until it lands on the desk of the most famous and most feared fighting general in the United States Army. This is the story of what those soldiers did at Dachau. And it is the story of what George Patton said when they asked him to destroy his own men for it. If your father came home from that war and never spoke of it, if there was a room in the house you learned not to walk into, when the old newsreels came on, this is the kind of day they could not put into words. So let us try to put it into words for them. To understand how it happened, you have to go back. You have to understand who these men were before they ever saw that gate. Felix Sparks did not come from privilege. He was born in 1917 in San Antonio, Texas, and he grew up poor in the copper mining country of Arizona in a town called Miami. The Great Depression hit his family the way it hit millions of others, and when he finished high school, there was no money and no work waiting for him. So he left. He rode the rails west hunting for a job on a ship, and he found nothing. He ended up sleeping in a park in San Francisco, out of money, out of ideas, with no plan and nowhere to go. An army recruiting sergeant walked past him on Market Street. That was the accident that decided the rest of his life. Sparks kept walking at first. Then he turned around and said yes. That was the beginning. By the spring of 1945, the boy from the park had become a battle-hardened battalion commander who had already survived some of the worst fighting of the entire war. He came ashore at Sicily. He came ashore at Salerno. He held the line at Anzio, where his men were pinned under German guns for months in a beachhead that nearly drove the Allies back into the sea. He fought up the length of Italy and then landed again in the south of France and pushed north toward Germany itself. His regiment, the 157th Infantry of the 45th Division, the men they called the Thunderbirds, would spend more than 500 days in combat before the war was over. He had watched entire companies of his men get cut apart. In the mountains near a village called WWII, in the bitter cold of early 1945, most of his battalion was surrounded and lost, and he could do nothing but listen to them over the radio as they ran out of ammunition. Felix Sparks was not a soft man. He was not naive, and he was not someone who flinched. That is what makes what happened at Dachau so important. Because Dachau reached even him. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing in on itself. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from the east. The Americans and British were pouring across the Rhine from the west. Adolf Hitler had days left to live. And as the Allied armies advanced into the heart of Germany, they began to open the gates of a system they had heard rumors about, but had never truly imagined. Just 17 days earlier, on April 12th, senior American commanders had walked into a smaller camp called Ohrdruf. Among them was General George Patton himself alongside Eisenhower and Bradley. They saw the bodies. They saw the evidence of starvation and execution and casual industrial cruelty. Patton, a man who had commanded troops through 2 world wars, stepped behind a building and was physically sick. Eisenhower forced himself to look at all of it, and he ordered it filmed and photographed because he said the day would come when some bastard would stand up and claim none of it had ever happened. That was Ohrdruf. Dachau was worse. Dachau was the first. It had opened in 1933 in the earliest months of Nazi rule, and for 12 years it had been the model that all the other camps were built to imitate. Tens of thousands of human beings had died inside its fences, and when Sparks and his men approached it on the morning of April 29th, roughly 32,000 prisoners were still alive inside, if the word alive can be stretched to cover what they had become. The men of the 157th smelled the camp before they saw it. Then they found the train. On a rail siding just outside the camp stood a line of boxcars, 39 of them, sitting still on the tracks. The soldiers went to look. Inside, packed into the wagons and spilling from the open doors, were bodies, nearly 2,000 of them. These were prisoners who had been evacuated from another camp and sent here by rail, and they had died along the way from starvation, from thirst, from suffocation, from being shot, and they had simply been left to rot in the open where they lay. These were combat veterans looking into those cars, men who believed there was nothing left in war that could shock them. Some stood and stared and could not speak. Some wept openly. Some turned away and vomited into the grass. And then slowly the grief in them began to turn into something else. It began to turn into rage. And that rage was walking straight toward the men who had run this place. But here is the first thing that most people never learn about that day. Dachau did not have to be taken by force. It had already been surrendered. The camp's real commandant, an SS officer named Martin Weiss, along with the regular guard staff who had actually run the place, had fled the day before the Americans arrived. They were gone. They had abandoned their posts and disappeared into the countryside to save themselves. Left behind was a young SS lieutenant named Heinrich Wicker, and he did the one thing his superiors had refused to do. He stayed. And when an American party approached, Wicker walked out under a white flag and formally surrendered the camp. By every rule of war, the killing should have stopped there. And here is the second thing, the fact that turns the whole story darker still. Many of the men in German uniform inside that camp on April 29th were not the monsters who had built Dachau's machinery of death. The men who had done that were already miles away. A large number of those who remained were replacement personnel and Waffen-SS troops of Hungarian origin brought in only days before, some of them wounded, some recovering men who had never held authority in that camp at all. The Americans could not have known that in the moment. And in the state they were in, standing between the boxcars and the barracks, it would not have mattered. They had seen the worst thing they would ever see in their lives. And the men who might answer for it were standing right in front of them with their hands in the air. It began at the railway gate. Lieutenant William Walsh commanded I Company of the 157th, and it was his men who reached the boxcars first. Walsh had just seen what was inside those wagons. And when 4 German soldiers surrendered to him near the train, something in Walsh came loose. He forced them into an empty boxcar, and then he shot them. He emptied his pistol into men who had put their hands up beside the very train that had carried the dead. They were not all killed outright. Some lay on the floor of the car, wounded, moaning, still moving. So a young private named Albert Pruitt climbed up into the wagon after them, and with his rifle he finished what his lieutenant had started. That was the first blood spilled inside Dachau. That was not spilled in combat. It would not be the last. Deeper in the camp, more German prisoners were being rounded up and brought in from every direction, hands raised offering no fight. And Walsh, together with his executive officer, made a decision. That officer was Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Cherokee man from Oklahoma, the second in command of I Company. Together they began to sort the prisoners. The regular German army soldiers, the Wehrmacht, were pushed to one side. The men identified as SS were pulled out and marched separately toward an enclosed yard where the camp stored its coal. Roughly 50 of them were lined up against a long masonry wall, about 8 feet high, that ran along the edge of that yard. An American machine gun crew from I Company was set up facing them. The SS men stood with their backs to the brick and their hands above their heads. And this is where Felix Sparks enters the yard. Sparks had been moving through the camp, trying to hold his battalion together, trying to keep control of thousands of screaming, weeping liberated prisoners and hundreds of surrendering enemy at the same time. He came into the coal yard and he saw the SS men lined against the wall and the machine gun pointed at them. He stopped. He watched for a moment, and then, believing the situation was in hand, he turned and started walking toward the center of the camp where SS men were still holding out and still shooting. He had gone only a short distance when he heard it, a voice behind him yelling, and then the machine gun opened up. Sparks spun around and ran back the way he had come. The gun was hammering. The men at the wall were going down, and behind the weapon crouched one of his own soldiers, a boy of 19. Sparks did not stop to think. He drew his pistol and fired it into the air. He reached the gun and kicked the boy off it with his boot, grabbed him by the collar, and hauled him to the ground. "What the hell are you doing?" The boy could barely answer. He was crying, shaking hysterical. "They were trying to escape," he said. That was all he had. Sparks did not believe him. He would say later that he doubted very much that any of them had been trying to escape. But by the time he ended it, the gunner had killed around a dozen of the prisoners and wounded more. Sparks put a sergeant on the gun, a man he could trust to keep his fingers still, and the shooting in the coal yard stopped. But the coal yard was not the only place men died that afternoon. At one of the guard towers, called Tower B, another group of SS men was killed. In other corners of the camp, guards were shot in ones and twos as they were found. And it was not only Americans doing the killing. The prisoners, themselves the living skeletons the Americans had come to save, rose up when they saw their tormentors disarmed. Some of them fell upon the guards with their bare hands and with whatever tools they could find. American soldiers stood by and let it happen, and some of them handed the prisoners weapons to do it. How many Germans died at Dachau on April 29th outside of combat is a question that has never been fully answered. The most careful estimates place it somewhere between about 35 and 50. In the coal yard itself, the documented number of dead is closer to 16 or 17. Hold on to those numbers, because they matter and because they are about to be twisted almost beyond recognition. But before the counting and the covering up began, there was one more confrontation that day. And it did not involve the enemy at all. By Sparks's own account, while the killing was still fresh, another American general arrived at Dachau. He had come to see the camp, and he came with reporters, trailing behind him, and he began to conduct himself as though the whole liberation belonged to him. He wanted control of the camp handed over. He wanted the moment and the cameras. Felix Sparks refused. This was his battalion's ground, bought at a cost that a visiting general and a pack of journalists could not begin to understand. When the general pressed him and grew indignant, Sparks did something that should have ended his career on the spot. He raised the same pistol he had fired into the air over the coal yard, and this time he pointed it toward a superior officer of the United States Army. It did not come to shooting. The moment passed. But there it is, the promise made at the start of this story. That pistol raised twice in a single afternoon. Once to stop his own men from committing murder, and once to keep a grandstanding general away from the graves of the men he had already lost. That is the kind of man Sparks was, and that is the state every American in that camp was in that day. Then the reports began to travel. Word of what had happened in the coal yard moved up through division and up through corps, and the army did what the army does. It opened an investigation. A lieutenant colonel named Joseph Whittaker, from the Inspector General's office of the 7th Army, was assigned to find out exactly what American soldiers had done to surrendered prisoners at Dachau. He took sworn testimony. He built a file, and that file pointed toward courts-martial, and here is the cruelty of it. Among the names swept into that investigation was Felix Sparks himself, the man who had run into the coal yard, the man who had kicked the gunner off the weapon, the man who had physically stopped the massacre with his own body and his own pistol now stood accused alongside the men who had carried it out. The officer who had done the one right thing in that yard was going to be tried for the wrong things done around him. That is the moment the story stopped being about rage and started being about justice. About what a nation does when its own heroes and its own criminals turn out sometimes to be standing in the very same yard. And then decades later, the numbers themselves would be weaponized. In 1986, one of the men who had been at Dachau that day, a former battalion surgeon named Howard Buechner, published a book. In it, he claimed that the killing at Dachau had been something far larger and far more deliberate than the record showed. He wrote of a mass execution of hundreds of SS men, gunned down on a single order of a death toll that climbed past 500. It was not true. Buechner's own sworn testimony given to Whitaker back in 1945, when the events were fresh and the bodies were real, told a smaller and more terrible story than the one he sold to readers 40 years later. His later numbers have been examined and rejected by serious historians. But the legend was already loose in the world. The idea that American troops had lined up and executed 500 surrendered men at Dachau still circulates today, louder and easier to repeat than the harder, quieter truth. The truth was bad enough. American soldiers had killed men who had surrendered. That was a war crime, and no one who was honest tried to pretend otherwise. The only question left was what the army was going to do about it. And the answer to that question was about to depend on one man. The camp had been taken by the 7th Army, not by Patton. That is a detail worth stopping on because almost everyone gets it wrong. The soldiers who walked into Dachau, the men of the 45th Division, belonged to the 7th Army under a different commander entirely. When people tell this story, they imagine Patton's own men doing the killing and Patton reaching down to save them. That is not what happened. What happened is quieter and stranger, and it comes down to a map. When Germany fell, the country was carved into zones of occupation, and the region that held Dachau, the whole of Bavaria, was placed under the authority of a single military governor. That governor was George Patton. So even though it was not his army that opened the gates, it was his desk, in the end, that the Dachau file had to cross. The most famous fighting general in the United States Army now held administrative power over the ground where the massacre had taken place. And the courts-martial could not go forward without passing through him. By then Felix Sparks was under a cloud, his command in question, waiting to learn whether he would be tried. And he was summoned to appear before the military governor of Bavaria. He expected the worst. Sparks walked into Patton's office, not knowing if this was the beginning of his court-martial or the end of his career. Patton had the investigation in front of him. He had read it. He knew what his own inspectors had recommended. And then Patton told him it was over. He told Sparks that he had already had these charges investigated and that they were a bunch of crap. He told him he had been a damn fine soldier. And then in front of him he took the papers. The whole file that could have sent Sparks and his men to prison, and he tore them up. He threw them away. No trial, no cross-examination, no record left to prosecute. That is the answer to the question this story began with. That is what Patton said when they asked him to court-martial the soldiers who killed the SS guards. He called the charges garbage, and he destroyed them with his own hands. Sparks was restored to his command, and no American soldier was ever prosecuted for what happened at Dachau on April 29th. It would be easy to end there on the image of the gruff old general protecting his men, tearing up the paperwork, doing the human thing. Easy and comforting and incomplete. Because Patton's mercy did not come out of nowhere. It fit a pattern that stretched back years. 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, American soldiers had murdered surrendered prisoners near a town called Biscari. Dozens of them killed after they gave up. And those killings too involved men of the 45th Division, the very same division that would later walk into Dachau. When that case came forward, Patton's documented response treated the affair as a problem to be managed rather than a crime to be exposed. In his own diary, he weighed whether the dead might simply be certified as snipers so the whole thing could be made to go away. So when Patton tore up the Dachau file, he was not stepping outside of who he had always been. He was being exactly who he had always been. A commander who would forgive almost anything in the men who did his fighting. A general whose loyalty ran to his soldiers first and to the written law a distant second. Whether that made him a good man or a dangerous one is a question people still argue over. Both sides have a case, and there was one more voice in the record, quieter than Patton's, but harder to dismiss. A senior army lawyer named Charles Decker reviewed the Dachau killings later that year. Decker did not pretend nothing had happened. He wrote plainly that there had almost certainly been a violation of the laws of war, that surrendered men had been shot without trial. But then he wrote the sentence that closed the case. He said that in the light of the conditions that greeted the eyes of the first troops to reach Dachau, it was not believed that justice demanded the difficult, perhaps impossible task of fixing individual blame. Read that again. The army's own lawyer admitted it was a war crime. and in the same breath he said the horror of the camp was so total that no court could fairly untangle who deserved to be punished. So no one would be. That was the final verdict of the United States Army on Dachau. Not innocent, not guilty, simply set down and left where it lay. And the man who set it down did not have long to live. Within months of tearing up those papers, George Patton's own career came apart. That same autumn, he was relieved as military governor of Bavaria, undone, not by the massacre he had buried, but by his own reckless words, his contempt for the process of denazification, his talk of the men he had spent 4 years fighting. The army moved him aside, and on the 9th of December 1945, driving out to go hunting, his car collided with a truck on a road in Germany. His neck was broken. He lingered for 12 days, unable to move. On the 21st of December 1945, George Patton died. The general who decided that no one would answer for Dachau was dead less than 8 months after the camp fell. Felix Sparks lived on. He went home. He became a lawyer and a district attorney and eventually a justice of his state's Supreme Court. He rose to brigadier general in the Colorado National Guard. He raised a family and buried the men he had lost and carried Dachau with him for the rest of his days. He never denied what his soldiers had done in that coal yard. He never pretended it had been clean, but he defended those men until the day he died in 2007 at the age of 90, because he had stood where they stood, and he had smelled what they smelled, and he understood. And the photograph remained. That single image, the American officer with the raised pistol, the SS men, dead along the wall, survived everything. It outlived Patton, who buried the case. It outlived Sparks, who stopped the killing and was blamed for it. It still asks the same question. It asked the day it was taken, a question with no comfortable answer. These men walked into the worst thing human beings have ever built. They found the trains and the ovens and 32,000 living skeletons who had prayed for exactly this moment. And in their rage and their grief, some of them became for a few terrible minutes a smaller echo of the very thing they had come to destroy. Were they monsters? Or were they men pushed past the edge of what any man can bear? Was Patton's mercy an act of decency or the covering up of a crime? If the law bends every time the evil is great enough, then what is the law worth? And if it does not bend even here, even at the gates of Dachau, then what is mercy worth? There are no easy answers. There is only the wall and the men who fell against it, and the photograph that will not let any of us look away.